Welcome back to the Bible in Context,
where context is king and the original author's intent drives our interpretation. Last week, we started this conversation, and we talked about how often when we think about prophecy, we think simply about them predicting the future, kind of like crystal ball approach. But the Bible really presents prophecy with a bit more nuance. Prophets in the Old Testament were spokesmen for God who had a message for the people of their day. And ideally, they were advisors to the king, and they were helping the king make godly decisions. But often we see that the king and the Israelites were in rebellion against God, and so the prophets served to call the Israelites back to covenant faithfulness. And so last week we looked at some examples that showed how God would interact relationally with his people. And so often the prophets would act kind of like a fork in the road, giving his people two options. One that leads to life and the other one that would lead to death. And so it wasn't unusual for God to, it seemed like, kind of change direction with his people based on how they responded to the prophet's message. And so this is why sometimes you'll see in the Old Testament a prophet warn the Israelites of God's imminent wrath, but then they repent, and God is gracious instead of wrathful. And so what are we going to be talking about this week, Caleb?
All right, so I think we should probably start out talking about how the New Testament actually uses, and we're going to bring up quite a few examples and might border on getting tedious, but I really want to show that this is just the standard way the New Testament authors look at the prophets. It's not prediction, but they're doing what we've referred to as typology. They're seeing patterns in the Old Testament. They're taking the words of the prophets and they're plugging Jesus into them, not to say that Jesus is the predicted event from that prophet, but the promise that God made through this prophet is now being fulfilled through Jesus. So it's not about the prophet making a prediction of events in the future, but it's rather about the prophet revealing the intentions of God, and God is acting on those intentions through Jesus.
So I know that I've heard it said that, gosh, if you looked at all the predictions of the Old Testament that were fulfilled in Jesus, like mathematically it's an impossibility, and so it proves the Old Testament. Yeah. And I'm wondering, maybe that's not the best way to articulate what's going on with the prophecies in the Old Testament.
Right. I think that actually gets it kind of backwards. And also, I want to just point out that a lot of people have reasonably maybe even built their faith on statements like that.
Right.
And so I want to handle this gently and in a way that still shows the faithfulness of the Bible, but I want us to properly understand prophecy. One, so we can just understand the Bible a little better and what it says to us, and what it doesn't say to us as well. But also, if we base our truth claims on misunderstandings, then if someone comes along and challenges those and shows you where there's holes in it, well then the basis for my faith is now ripped out from under me, and I don't want that to happen.
Right.
That's why we want to look at this and even present some things that are challenging that I think will help the church and Bible-believing people in the long run if we just sit and wrestle with this difficult topic for a while. So maybe we should start off with a few examples of places in the New Testament where it says this Old Testament prophecy was fulfilled. There are places in the New Testament where fulfilled language isn't used, but Old Testament prophecies are cited. But we're just going to use the ones that say, thus was fulfilled some scripture. It's like a dozen passages or so. But I'm just going to use those because this is a podcast, not a book or something like that. So I don't want to go on and do this forever. And I'm sure you all don't want to either. So let's start off with a couple of those. We can stop and talk about them as we go. So the first one, we did bring up last week, Matthew 2:15 and Hosea 11:1, and we showed how that's more of Matthew doing typology. He's taking Jesus and fitting him into the Exodus pattern while also taking the chance to call Jesus God's son. Go listen to last week's episode to get a little more about that. We're not going to talk about that one this week because we've already covered it a bit. So let's start off with Matthew 1:22 through 23 and his quotation of Isaiah 7:14.
So I can read this. All this took place to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet. And then here's the quotation. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel, which means God with us.
All right. in Isaiah, I'm not going to go back and read this because this is a couple chapters worth of text that he's referring to through this little quote. One thing we need to mention is, and G.K. Beale and those who have worked with him in the commentary on the New Testament use of the Old and some of his other works, they've pointed out, I think convincingly, that often whenever the New Testament will grab a quote from the Old Testament, on occasion they may be just pulling in that one quote, but often they're pulling in an entire passage. They're trying to get you to remember that whole passage, or they're pulling in an entire typological thread, just like with Hosea, where he said, "Out of Egypt I called my son." That wasn't just referring to that one event, but it was referring to the expectation of Israel coming out of an exodus, both in the past and in the future. So in this passage, in Isaiah 7, what's going on is there are some armies that are coming and threatening Israel. And so Isaiah comes and says, God will wipe out these armies that are threatening us. Ask for a sign. He tells the king to ask for a sign. And the king kind of blows him off. And so God comes back and says, okay, look, I'm still going to wipe out those kings, but now I'm going to do it by bringing in a bigger nation that's going to wipe them out and you. And also I'm going to give you a sign myself. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel. And this kid's going to eat like a poor kid by the time he's old enough to eat, because you guys are going to be wiped out and desolated. That's the thrust of that passage. And also Isaiah, he doesn't say that a virgin shall conceive, but rather he says a young woman shall conceive. The word really doesn't mean virgin in the Old Testament. It just refers to a young woman. And just by the explanation of Isaiah that I just gave, we got to realize that within the context, this is not a future prediction, as in hundreds of years later, referring to Mary and Jesus. This is referring to a young woman giving birth in Isaiah's day as a sign that Israel's going to be wiped out. So that's all of this refers to Isaiah's day. So then why in the world does Matthew pick up on this? There's two ways to take Matthew's reference to Isaiah 7 here. One way is to look at Isaiah chapter 9, which is part of the same speech of Isaiah. In chapters 7 through 8, Isaiah is saying essentially Israel will be destroyed. And in chapter 9, Isaiah switches gears and says eventually this destruction is going to be over and there will be a time of instead redemption and restoration. And so in chapter 7, the sign of all this destruction is this child born of a young woman. And in chapter 9, it starts off saying that there will be another child born. And this child, instead of being a sign of destruction, will be the famous passage of Isaiah 9, 6 through 7, where it says, "For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulders, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and of peace there will be no end, on the throne of David and over his kingdom, to establish it and uphold it," and so on. And so what Matthew may be doing here is taking the chance to apply the term Emmanuel, meaning God with us, to Jesus, to say that this child is God with us, and then also to look towards the hope of the future child in Isaiah 9 that will be messianic.
So is there evidence in Isaiah that these children were actually born, like back in Isaiah's day?
There's no child explicitly called Emmanuel born. It would be in chapter 8 where there's other children that are being discussed that are signs of destruction and things like that. But from chapter 7, the oracle is very explicitly for that day and cannot be for any child beyond that day, because this child is a sign of the coming destruction, and the destruction did happen. So the child has to be born before that destruction, otherwise the prophecy didn't come true. So Emmanuel in Isaiah 7 cannot be applied to Jesus from the text of Isaiah. Now, the second way that I want to just talk about for a second of how Matthew could be using Isaiah is, remember I said that in Isaiah 7, Isaiah said, hey, there's kings coming to destroy you. Ask for a sign from God, and he will give you a sign showing you that he's going to destroy these kings. The king showed contempt for that, and so Isaiah says, okay, God has now said he's going to give you a sign, this child, and instead of being a sign of hope and deliverance, he's going to be a sign of destruction, because I'm going to send somebody else to wipe you out. And so it's possible that Matthew is also using Emmanuel to, again, take the chance to apply God with us to Jesus, but also to say, remember the original deliverance that the sign from God was supposed to represent in Isaiah? Well, this Emmanuel, Jesus, is going to be that deliverance. And so whether whether Matthew is picking up on the deliverance of chapter 7 that could have been, or he's picking up on the Davidic kingly child of chapter 9, the point is Emmanuel is not looking forward to the future, but rather Matthew is taking the chance to apply the name Emmanuel to Jesus and to get you to remember the deliverance promised back then.
So he's creating a hyperlink, like God has worked this way in the past, and he's about to do it again.
Right. Yeah, the point is never, hey, look, there was this prediction back then about Jesus, and now here's Jesus finally. It's more about, hey, there's this pattern of, in this case, deliverance that happened back here. Well, what I'm telling you is that Jesus is going to bring about a similar thing, a similar deliverance.
Yeah.
Okay, let's look at another one. And that one's honestly, I think, the most confusing one. And again, Beale's work and his commentary, I'm largely agreeing with what they say. So that's a great resource to check out. And I'm not saying anything that's crazy or new. This has already been well-trodden ground. So another one is Matthew 2:23.
Which says, "And he went and lived in a city called Nazareth, so that what was spoken by the prophets might be fulfilled, that he would be called a Nazarene."
Okay, this one is famously known for not having any Old Testament reference anywhere. And so what in the world is he talking about? Well, in Isaiah 11:1, we're told, "There shall come forth a shoot from the stump of Jesse, and a branch from his roots shall bear fruit." And the word there for branch is the word netzer. And so what's likely going on here is simply a wordplay. There's nowhere that it was prophesied that the Messiah should be a Nazarene. Matthew is capitalizing on the fact that Nazareth and netzer are very similar. And so in Isaiah 11:1, we're told that a netzer, a branch, shall come forth from Jesse. This is that Davidic king that we're looking for. And so essentially, all that Matthew is doing is saying, hey, Jesus comes from Branch City. He's the branch man. He is the shoot from the stump of Jesse. He's the Davidic king. He's just using a little wordplay to fit Jesus into the slot of the branch from Jesse, of that Davidic son. So there's no actual prophecy going on there. There's just a wordplay linking Jesus to the Old Testament expectation of a Davidic king.
Okay, what do we do about this passage? So John 1:45. So this is Philip found Nathanael and said to him, "We have found him of whom Moses in the law and also the prophets wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph." So do we look at that the same way, that what he means there is the law and the prophets weren't specifically talking about Jesus, but they were foretelling this pattern? Or because it seems like he's saying that they were specifically talking about Jesus.
Yeah, this is the same. You get to the same question with Luke 24:44, where it says that all the scriptures are written about me.
Right.
Everything in Moses and the prophets. And so I think this can actually be very easily understood without seeing it as future prediction. Because Moses said there's going to be a prophet like me, and there's going to be this Judahite king that comes forth, and then as you go on in the biblical story, we find out that's going to be a Davidic king, and so the prophets are all prophesying about this Davidic king that's going to come.
Okay.
Not because they're predicting that there will be a king from David's line, but rather God has promised to raise up a king from David's line, and so God is continually working through that family.
Okay.
So he's going to cause that.
So they were anticipating a savior, king, yes. A kingly savior,
yeah.
A Messiah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, from the very beginning of the biblical story, where as soon as the fall happens, God says, like, look, I'm going to find a way to bring humanity back to this Edenic state. I'm going to bring he promises to Eve, I'm going to bring one of your children up to be a redeemer for you. And so it's not necessarily that each time the prophet says there's going to be a Davidic king, they were looking forward and seeing Jesus, son of Mary and all this stuff. They just knew there's going to be a Davidic king because God has promised he's going to use a Davidic person.
Right.
And so by the time, there was Zerubbabel, he was a good candidate, and God actually was going to use him. Well, something happens in Zechariah, and things do not go well, and so it's stalled. And eventually God comes and does it himself as the Davidic king, as Jesus. So those passages about, all the scriptures point to me, or, hey, we found this one who the scriptures have spoken about, is not necessarily to be understood as prediction, but to be understood as, hey, this is the person who God is using to fulfill all of his promises previously. Okay, let's look at one more. Let's look at Matthew 4:14 through 16.
So that what was spoken by the prophet Isaiah might be fulfilled, the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, the way of the sea, beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles, the people dwelling in darkness have seen a great light, and for those dwelling in the region and shadow of death, on them a light has dawned.
Okay, so the first chunk of this prophecy is taken from Isaiah 9, which we just talked about, where in Isaiah 7 and 8, there's basically God promises through Isaiah he's going to send a king to destroy Israel. And when you get to Isaiah 9, he's saying there's going to be people returning from that exile and from that destruction. And they're going to come from the north because Assyria and Babylon, that's where they dwell. And so the idea is the exiles would return from the north and come through Zebulun and Naphtali through this way by the sea. That's the way that they would return. So that's why these specific geographical places are mentioned. And what that entire section of Isaiah has in mind is a return of Israel from exile. That is a picture of God's redemption, his deliverance of his people. And so again, Matthew is plugging Jesus into this section of Isaiah that depicts deliverance, not because, again, it was a prediction about Jesus' actions, but rather he is linking Jesus, and he's linking Jesus with promises of deliverance and saying that the promises of deliverance that God has made in the past, he is replaying through Jesus. And there are other elements of this particular verse that come from Isaiah 42, Psalm 23, Amos 5, but the thrust is, yes, this was about the return of all of Israel from exile after the Assyrian or Babylonian attack described in Isaiah, which is mainly about the Assyrian at first. And they do come back from exile, in Zerubbabel's day, after Persia has taken over. So none of that was necessarily looking forward to the exact events of Jesus, and you can't really get it to map on. The point that Matthew's trying to make is that Jesus is linked to the patterns of Yahweh's deliverance. Another one is Matthew 8:17, where it says that, well, I'll start in verse 16, where it says, "That evening there were many brought to him who were oppressed by demons, and he cast out the spirits, and with a word he healed those who were sick. This was to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet Isaiah. He took our illnesses and bore our diseases." And again, this is looking back to Isaiah 53, the servant song, which many actually associate with the death and resurrection rather than his initial healings. But we've also talked about before in our conversation on Genesis 22 that I think Jim Hamilton has made convincingly the case that even Isaiah 53 is a typological expansion from Genesis 22, from Isaac's sacrifice. And so, again, he is just showing there's going to be this servant who part of his job description is going to be healing, and he's saying Jesus is this servant. He's not saying there were exact events here prophesied or predicted, but rather Jesus is fulfilling these promises and expectations linked to the delivering servant. Okay, this next one is from Matthew 12:17, starting there down through verse 21, and it's from the servant song. It starts out saying, "This was to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet Isaiah. Behold, my servant, with whom I have chosen, my beloved, with whom my soul is well pleased. I'll put my spirit on him, and he will proclaim justice to the Gentiles." It keeps going, but I'll stop there because this is from Isaiah 42, which is, again, part of the servant song in Isaiah. So the servant song starts out looking at the servant as Israel. So this one servant represents the nation of Israel. And as you get further in the servant song, it starts to seem like this servant is one particular person. But at this point in the servant song, it is definitely Israel. And if you keep reading in Isaiah 42, where this prophecy comes from, you see that the servant is a failure. And so this is not about Jesus, but rather Israel was chosen. He had God's Spirit on him, and he was to proclaim justice to the Gentiles and be righteous and all this stuff, but they failed. And so, again, this was not a prophecy of Jesus, but rather a description of Israel, what they were supposed to be. But Matthew is taking Jesus and putting him into this job description, saying this is going to be the servant that is going to do it right. Jesus is that servant. So again, not prediction, but typology. And that's what a lot of this is typology, taking Jesus and putting him into a context that would show that he's going to take on the job description that Israel was supposed to have. That's what a lot of these are doing, is just showing like, hey, that the original ideal of what Israel should have been, that's what Jesus is going to be. And that's why you have in Hosea 11:1 where it says, "Out of Egypt I called my son, but you guys were horrible." But yet Matthew decides to put Jesus in that context is because he's saying Israel came out, so did Jesus. Jesus is kind of a redo of Israel, and he's going to get it right. Okay, so another one is Matthew 13:35.
Which says, "This was to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet. I will open my mouth in parables. I will utter what has been hidden since the foundation of the world.
Okay, so this is pulling from Psalm 78, verse 2, where that word parable there, it can mean parable in the Hebrew, but it can also, it can mean a wide range of things that usually have to do with you revealing some knowledge. But the point of Jesus' parables were actually to conceal rather than to reveal knowledge. It was actually, if you look throughout the story, since the Jews were disbelieving of Jesus, he started to use parables so that they would not grasp his meaning intentionally. So really the opposite meanings are used in these two passages between Psalm 78 and Matthew 13. But the point is that in Psalm 78, the psalmist here is a teacher. And they're applying, again, that same teaching aspect to Jesus, even though here he is using parables for a different reason than the psalmist. But again, you have to see that this is not a predictive prophecy, given the fact that the psalmist is trying to reveal and Jesus is actually trying to conceal his message. The point is, again, that Jesus he is the ideal teacher, just like the psalmist is portrayed as kind of an ideal teacher. Zechariah 21:5, this one's actually a fun one. So in Matthew 21, can you read that one for us?
Yeah, say to the daughter of Zion, behold, your king is coming to you, humble and mounted on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a beast of burden.
Okay, so this is one where it seems very explicitly like, okay, the prophet looked into the future and saw Jesus riding on a donkey, and that's what's happening. But again, this is typology. So looking back, whenever Solomon was crowned king, he rode on his father's donkey, and so the donkey became kind of this symbol of the kingly Davidic inauguration. And I think this goes even further back to Genesis 49, where it talks about the Judahite king binding his foal to the vine, his donkey to the choice vine. And so there's this association between the Davidic king, the Judahite king, and his inauguration and the donkey. And so I think, again, Zechariah is not predicting, but he himself is doing typology by looking at the association of the donkey and the Judahite king in Genesis 49 and looking at Solomon's inauguration as he comes in riding on a donkey and saying the future Messiah, he's going to come in riding on a donkey, not to say that, yes, there will be a donkey, but rather to say that it's going to be a new Davidic king. The point is he's taking a Davidic pattern and projecting it forward just in order to make the point that this guy is going to be Davidic. And you have to realize that, yes, the prophets, they speak in poetry. This is very artistic, and it's not... As modern Westerners, this is weird because we prefer history and description, but they're, making God-inspired art here, essentially. And just so you know, that reference to Solomon is in 1 Kings 1, 33 and 38, where it refers to him coming in riding on a donkey at his inauguration. As Zechariah is looking towards this eschatological kingly fulfillment, he's using this element just to say, look, a Davidic king. Matthew 26.
So this is Matthew 26, starting in verse 54. But how then should the scriptures be fulfilled that it must be so? At that hour Jesus said to the crowds, have you come out against the robber and with swords and clubs to capture me? Day after day I sat in the temple teaching with you, and you did not seize me. But all this was to take place that the scriptures of the prophets might be fulfilled. And then all the disciples left him and fled.
Okay. So this one, there's actually not any Old Testament reference associated with this passage. How is it that the people coming out with swords and clubs to capture him, in this setting, why is that to take place so that the scriptures might be fulfilled? And I think, again, we've seen this in Genesis plenty. We've talked about this. The fact that there is always rivalry between the chosen one and the non-chosen brother. And so all throughout Genesis, we have hostility towards the chosen one created as an expectation, like a core part of the picture of the chosen one is that he's going to receive hostilities from his own brothers. And that's projected on through the rest of the Old Testament as, you see David and Solomon is another high point with that theme. All throughout the prophets, you see the same thing where the chosen one is going to suffer or to die. And so all throughout the prophets, you see the same thing where there's this chosen one, and he's also shown hostility, typically from his own people as well. And so again, this one doesn't even have an Old Testament reference, but because of the typology, the pattern, Jesus sees that, okay, since every chosen one pretty much has had hostilities from his brothers, that's to be expected with the Messiah. And so that's how he expects the scriptures to be fulfilled through the leaders of Jerusalem coming to get him.
So would you say that this pattern starts all the way back to Cain and Abel?
Yeah, I would say so. Yeah.
And you see it, especially like in the story of Joseph and his brothers. But yeah.
Yeah, and then I think it's Zechariah 11 where I think this picks up. We're about to talk about this passage as well, but where you also see again, I think similar hostilities shown towards the chosen one based off the pattern of Joseph.
Right. So would you say that this is not pointing back towards like Isaiah 53 though?
I think that's part of the pattern.
That is part of the pattern.
Probably,
okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't think Isaiah 53 is explicit that like his own people have. Well, it kind of is because it talks about he is struck because of the sins of the people, and a lot of people take that as penal substitution. However, I think that makes more sense as it's the people's actions who cause his death. That's maybe a topic
for
another time. But yeah. Anyway, so yeah, getting back to Matthew 27, where he actually references Zechariah 11:13. Matthew 27:9, it says, "Then was fulfilled what had been spoken by the prophet Jeremiah. And they took 30 pieces of silver, the price of him on whom a price had been set by some of the sons of Israel. And they gave them for the potter's field as the Lord directed me." And this is the passage from Zechariah that this is taken from in Zechariah 11:12 and 13. It says, "Then I said to them, if it seems good to you, give me my wages, but if not, keep them. And they weighed out as my wages 30 pieces of silver. Then the Lord said to me, throw it to the potter, the lordly price at which I was priced by them. So I took the 30 pieces of silver and threw them into the house of the Lord to the potter." So again, Matthew, he says Jeremiah. It's kind of debated as to why he says Jeremiah here. It could be that Jeremiah is used as kind of a book at the front of the collection Matthew's looking at, and so he says Jeremiah to reference all the prophets. That's a possibility. Or perhaps he is combining some elements from Jeremiah 18 where Jeremiah is interacting with the potter. But for our interest, we're going to be looking at Zechariah 11 because that's where the thrust of this link back to the Old Testament comes from. What's happening there in Zechariah 11 is you heard Zechariah or someone is being betrayed by his own people and for the price of 30 shekels of silver. And so Matthew is, again, linking that to Jesus because it's not that it's a prophecy, but rather it is placing Jesus in the place of betrayal by his own people for a price. And I think, again, this goes back to Joseph because Joseph was sold for 20 shekels of silver. Yes, there's a number difference there, but the pattern is very similar. Joseph is betrayed and sold for silver by his own brothers. And so I think there's, again, a pattern in Scripture here of betrayal for silver. Matthew sees that. He sees it happen in Jesus' life, and so he plugs Jesus into that to show that he also is a chosen one who has been sold for money, sold for silver. And this makes the point that Jesus is, again, a chosen one. That's the big picture here. Okay, so that's pretty much all of the fulfillment passages in Matthew. There are a handful more in John. I want to go through one more just because I think it's significant, but for the sake of time, we will not go through the rest of those unless someone, if you want to hear them, we can email in and we'll talk about it. But otherwise, a good resource for this is, again, Beale's commentary. He also has a shorter version called the Handbook on the New Testament use of the Old Testament. Pick that up. We just want to illustrate the point here, and I think we've gone long enough talking about this. But one more I just want to hit on because it's one that may cause some to trip up is John 13:18.
So it says, "I am not speaking of all of you. I know whom I have chosen. But the scripture will be fulfilled. He who ate my bread has lifted his heel against me."
Okay, so that sounds like a prediction, right? Because it's very specific. Someone is eating the same bread as Jesus, and then they will betray him, right?
Right.
Well, this comes from Psalm 41, verse 9. And the thing is, if you go back and listen to that psalm or read it, it is a very specific reflection on the betrayal of David by his own enemies of his day. And so again, this is not a prophecy, but rather the New Testament author has noticed a similarity between an Old Testament chosen one and Jesus and put them together. He has made the overlap so that we can better see Jesus as the chosen one. And that's what we need to highlight here is, I haven't said this quite so clearly yet, but what the New Testament authors are doing are not looking for predictions, but they are looking for similarities between Jesus' life and the lives of previous chosen ones and putting Jesus into those contexts in order to show he is the new, better chosen one. So he is the the new Joseph, he's the new Emmanuel, he's the new prophet, he's the new servant from Isaiah 53. They plug him into all these different contexts to show all these different expectations that God has promised in the past, how they're being fulfilled through him.
Right.
And so, this is about, again, not predictions coming true, but about God finally coming through on all of his promises and showing that all of those promises come to a head in Jesus and that he is the chosen one. Just like David was, just like Joseph was, just like the servant in Isaiah. He's the healer that the prophets talked about as well. Like all these different things. They're plugging him into these contexts to show not that these were prophesied beforehand as predictions, but that he's the guy through whom this typological thread is going to be heightened and realized.
So again, our point is that the Old Testament prophets were not fortune tellers or even meteorologists predicting the future. In that sense, they were God's spokesman. And so the New Testament looks back on the Old Testament and says, look, there's all these patterns. These are not predictions, but there's patterns. And Jesus fits into all of these patterns. Isn't that amazing?
Right. Yeah. Well, and sometimes it's not, sometimes it's that he directly fits. Sometimes it's that he doesn't fit, but rather they want us to see Jesus in the context of being a healer or being the ultimate teacher or something like that. And so the point of the Old Testament allusions in reference to Jesus are to make claims about Jesus rather than showing how he is fulfilling the Old Testament.
Right.
At the beginning of the episode, we talked about how many people will look through the Old Testament to see how Jesus is a fulfillment of direct predictions in the Old Testament. So how do we think about that now?
We don't think that way.
Yeah. And so what is the purpose of the Old Testament in relation to Jesus?
Well, the purpose of the prophets in the Old Testament were to help the people of their day. And what we see in the New Testament is that God is the same God, that God is still working in the same way, and that all of the things that were promised in the Old Testament, God continues to show his faithfulness. And Jesus is, I think, the ultimate example of God showing his faithfulness. And that's what the New Testament authors seem to be pointing out.
Yeah. And does Jesus prove the Old Testament then? Is that the point?
That's not the point, no. When with this fulfillment language, that's not the point of it. It's more that they're just pointing back to the Old Testament to show, to help us better understand who Jesus is now for us.
Right.
And they're basically saying, look, Jesus, he's just like this guy that you've heard about in the past. And so God is doing a work again, just like he did in the past, but it's even better now.
Right. Yeah, and whenever you make all these combined references, like we said a second ago, since they use he's the healer from Isaiah, he's the servant, he's the new Joseph, and all. So it's kind of like you want to build the picture of like the ultimate tech guy, and so you say this is like Steve Jobs and Bill Gates put together, that kind of thing, you know?
Right.
And so they're not just referencing back to like he's this one character that was predicted, but rather all these different people that God was working in, he's like the ultimate combination of all these guys and more.
Right.
And so Jesus does not prove the correctness of the Old Testament. Rather, the Old Testament prophets were already validated in their own day by God, and that's why they were authoritative before Jesus came on the scene, because they accurately delivered the promises and encouragements, rebukes, whatever, from God. But Jesus, he is, as you said, he's the fulfillment of God's promises, not the predictions, fulfillments of the promises that God had made.
That's a good way to put it. I like that.
And so I just want to say one more thing about that, and that's if you go through the Old Testament looking for eschatology, it can be very confusing, and that's why there's so many different systems out there, people that have built their eschatology on different books of the Old Testament. And I think part of that is because it may be that God has promised to do things in a certain way in one Old Testament book to a certain generation, but that generation, they are not loyal to God. The political situation changes. Israel's in exile, and so the promises that God makes are going to be a little bit different. They're still all pointing towards the goal of, I'm going to give the Davidic king and bring you all back to the garden. That's still the hope. But the actual details of the promises may look different from book to book based on the situation that Israel finds themselves in.
Right.
So as you're reading the Old Testament and the prophets, try to read it as though you're part of the original audience hearing this for the first time, not trying to build eschatological systems or apply this all to the end times, things like that. That'd be a good lens to read the Old Testament through. And there's one more thing I need to say about how the apostles and the New Testament use prophecy. Again, we weren't exhaustive. We mainly talked about Matthew, but the principle stays true throughout the rest of the New Testament. And I'm going to somewhat say what I just said, but from a different angle. And that's that if the apostles are using these typological categories, if they're trying to associate Jesus with Old Testament patterns and characters and promises rather than showing predictions, it seems like the New Testament authors are using a more or less rational means of interpretation. Because if they were using actual future prediction, then such as that example in Hosea 11:1, well, they're cherry-picking verses and it doesn't make any sense because Israel and Jesus were both called out of Egypt, but Israel was unfaithful, Jesus was not. So Hosea 11 can't apply to Jesus. And if they are future predicting and cherry-picking verses like that, then they don't have a systematic, reasonable method for applying these prophecies to Jesus. And so therefore, we have no basis by which we can start to look at prophecies and find out how they're fulfilled. Because the apostles would then be just operating on some other alien plane of reason for interpreting these prophecies. But I think that it is reasonable if we see the New Testament authors interpreting prophecy not as future prediction fulfillment, but as pointing back to patterns and other chosen ones throughout biblical history in order to show how Jesus is the ultimate chosen one and the fulfillment of God's promises.
Good discussion. Next week we're going to jump back into Genesis.
Yeah, we'll start talking about Joseph again and start talking about the testing of his brothers, and we're getting close to the end, actually. So
yeah, it's crazy.
Yeah, after that we'll have a discussion actually with Carmen Imes on the book of Exodus, and from there, I guess, are we planning on going to Ephesians?
We had talked about going to Ephesians, yeah.
Okay. Well, first we'll have a long discussion on canon. So
yes.
Yeah, if any of you have questions on the formation of the canon, definitely send those in, and we want to try and hit on those because we're going to try to dig deep and it's probably going to turn into a bit of a series on the canon before we move on.
Sounds like a plan.